She appeared in the courtroom in Maricopa County, Arizona, with a cold and unreadable expression. In front of her was not a minor charge, not a family argument that had gone too far, and not an accident she could explain away with a few vague words. She was a mother, and the two children the entire trial was talking about were her own biological children. In court, the story this mother wanted the world to see was not a story of calculation. It was wrapped in the appearance of disorder, panic, and confusing statements after the incident happened. She had said that she heard voices. She made the case look like a moment of lost control, a mental crisis, or something even she could not explain herself. If that was all someone heard, some people might think this was a tragedy of illness, of a woman falling apart after a divorce, or of a family that had fallen into chaos after arguments over money and moving back to Japan. But then the evidence came out. Before the tragedy happened, Tempe police had been called to the apartment because of a family incident. When the officers arrived, Mia Inoue, 9 years old, and Kai Inoue, 7 years old, were still alive. The two children were sleeping. At that time, the apartment was not yet a death scene. No one knew that only after the police left, everything would change in a way that could not be reversed. A few hours later, that same mother appeared at the Tempe police station and told officers that she heard voices telling her to hurt her children. When police returned to the apartment, they discovered the truth no family should ever have to face. Mia and Kai were no longer alive. What you are about to watch is not an ordinary family crime case. This is the story of one night in Tempe, Arizona, where a post-divorce argument, strange statements, and the mother's actions afterward became the center of a trial that left the entire courtroom silent. And every detail you are watching has been verified through investigative records, indictments, testimony in court, statements from prosecutors, and the sentence handed down at Maricopa County Superior Court. This is a case that shook Arizona, not only because the two victims were so young, but also because of the chilling question behind it. How could police see two children still alive inside the apartment, then return only a few hours later and discover that everything was already too late? If you have never heard this story before, prepare yourself, because what happened in Tempe, Arizona on the 15th of May 2021 will force you to question divorce, hatred, mental crisis, and the terrifying line between a family argument and an unforgivable crime. To understand why Yui Inoue eventually had to stand before the court, be convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of child abuse, and 1 count of disorderly conduct, then receive 2 consecutive natural life sentences, plus an additional 35 years in prison, we have to go back to before Tempe police returned to the apartment for the second time. Before the statement about voices appeared, before the apartment in Tempe became a crime scene, and before the 2 children, Mia and Kai Inoue, became the center of one of the most heartbreaking family crime cases in Arizona in recent years. In Tempe, Arizona, Yui Inoue lived in an apartment near Mill Avenue and Southern Avenue with her 2 children, 9-year-old Mia Inoue and 7-year-old Kai Inoue. To anyone outside the home, it may have looked like another family caught in the painful final stage of a marriage breaking apart. But behind that ordinary setting was a relationship already under strain. Inoue and her former husband were either recently divorced or in the middle of that separation, and prosecutors later said the conflict had become focused on money, control, and Inoue's plan to return to Japan. Mia and Kai were still young enough to be fully dependent on the adults around them, but old enough to have routines, school lives, belongings, and a sense of home. Their apartment was supposed to be a safe place. Instead, in the early morning hours of the 15th of May, 2021, it became the center of a case that would later shock Tempe and move through the courts for nearly 4 years. The first sign of danger came before sunrise. Inoue's former husband called Tempe police to report a domestic dispute. According to prosecutors, he and Inoue had been arguing about money connected to her possible move back to Japan. The argument escalated inside the apartment. Prosecutors said Inoue became aggressive and used a meat cleaver to damage her former husband's computer and other electronic items. He left the apartment and contacted police. When officers arrived, the situation still appeared to be a domestic conflict between adults. The most important fact from that first police visit was that Mia and Kai were still alive. Officers saw the children sleeping, There were no visible injuries to them at that time, and the officers left the apartment after handling the dispute. That moment would later become one of the most painful points in the entire timeline. Police had been inside the home. They had seen the children alive. Then they walked away, not knowing that the real danger had not passed. After the officers left, Inoue's former husband did not remain inside the apartment. Public reporting described him as having left the home and spent time away from the apartment. Inside, Yui Inoue was alone with Mia and Kai. The timeline that followed became the heart of the prosecution's case. Prosecutors said that after police left, Inoue went into the children's bedroom. There, she caused fatal injuries to both children using the same type of heavy kitchen blade that had already been part of the earlier dispute. The details were later presented in court, but for the purpose of telling the case responsibly, what matters is this. Mia and Kai were found to have suffered fatal harm inside the apartment after officers had seen them alive only hours earlier. The state argued that this was not followed by an immediate call for help. Instead, prosecutors said Inoue took several steps inside the apartment after the children were harmed. She placed bloodied clothing into a trash bag. She wiped part of the blade. She showered. She prepared a backpack containing passports, cash, and jewelry. Then, according to the prosecution, she used items in the home, including trash, boxes, a mattress, and other objects, to cover the bodies of Mia and Kai. After that, she locked the apartment and left. Those actions became central at trial. The state did not treat them as random movement by a confused person. Prosecutors argued they showed sequence, awareness, and an attempt to control what anyone would see when they later entered the apartment. The defense would later challenge the state's conclusions, but the prosecution built its case around the order of events: the dispute, the first police visit, the children seen alive, the harm inside the apartment, the cleanup, the concealed scene, and Inoue's arrival at the police station. Later that morning, around 7 to 7:30, Inoue went to a Tempe police station. This was not a standard 911 call from a neighbor or a family member who had found the children. Inoue herself appeared at the station and spoke to an officer. According to official summaries and court reporting, she said she had heard voices connected to the children being dead and that she had seen blood. It is important to say this carefully. Those were statements Inoue made to police. They were not, by themselves, a medical finding or a final explanation for her mental state. Those statements immediately changed the direction of the morning. Officers who had already been to the apartment now had a new reason to return. The first visit had ended with the children alive and asleep. The second visit would reveal what had happened after the officers left. When Tempe police went back to the apartment, they found Mia and Kai dead inside. Prosecutors said the children had been covered with household items, including trash, boxes, and a mattress. What officers saw inside the home turned the earlier domestic dispute into a double homicide investigation. The same apartment that had seemed calm enough for officers to leave only hours before was now a crime scene. Inoue quickly became the primary suspect. She had been the adult left in the apartment with Mia and Kai after her former husband left. She had gone to the police station and made statements about voices, blood, and the children. Investigators also focused on the physical evidence. Police found items connected to the case, including the meat cleaver, clothing with blood, signs of cleanup, and items that prosecutors said showed Inoue had prepared to leave or move. They also noted her actions after the deaths, including showering, locking the apartment, and leaving with a backpack containing important documents and valuables. The investigation was built around a tight timeline. First, the former husband reported the domestic dispute. Second, officers arrived and saw the children alive. Third, the officers left. Fourth, Inoue remained inside with the children. Fifth, she later went to the police station and made disturbing statements. Sixth, officers returned and found Mia and Kai dead. For prosecutors, that sequence gave the case its structure. The window of time was narrow, and they argued that the evidence pointed directly to Inoue. The case also included statements from Inoue after her arrest. There is no complete public transcript of every interview question and answer, but reports described key points. Inoue spoke primarily in Japanese, so interpretation was part of the process. She reportedly told investigators that she woke up with blood on her hands and arms and did not remember what she had done. She also said things about voices and seeing blood. At her first court appearance, she denied taking anyone's life. The court instructed her not to discuss the facts of the case, except with her attorney. From the beginning, the defense had a difficult path. There was no question that Mia and Kai were found inside the apartment after being seen alive only hours earlier. There was also no question that Inoue had gone to police with statements about voices and blood. But the defense focused on whether the state could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Inoue was the person who caused the deaths. They also raised questions about the physical nature of the injuries and whether a woman of Inoue's size and strength could have caused them in the way the prosecution described. For years, the case moved through the legal system. The charges were severe: 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of child abuse, and 1 count of disorderly conduct connected to the domestic dispute before the children were found. The case was not resolved quickly. By the time it reached trial in February 2025, the jury had to evaluate not only the emotional weight of the deaths, but the evidence itself. At trial, prosecutors presented the story as a clear chain of choices. They argued that the earlier argument with her former husband gave the case a motive. They said Inoue was angry over money, the divorce, and the plan to move back to Japan. They pointed to the fact that the children were alive when police first came to the apartment. They emphasized that after the officers left, Inoue was the adult left with Mia and Kai. Then they highlighted her actions afterward: the clothing in a trash bag, the partially cleaned blade, the shower, the backpack, the passports, the money, the jewelry, the covered bodies, the locked door, and the trip to the police station. The prosecution also argued that Inoue's own statements did not create reasonable doubt. A person saying they heard voices or did not remember, the state argued, did not erase the physical evidence or the timeline. Prosecutors asked jurors to look at what she did before, during, and after the children's deaths. In their view, those actions showed not only opportunity, but awareness. The defense pushed back. They argued that no one saw the fatal incident happen. They reminded jurors that the state's burden was high. They questioned whether the evidence truly excluded every reasonable alternative. They also challenged the prosecution's theory about the level of force involved and whether Inoue could have caused the injuries as described. The defense tried to separate suspicion from proof, arguing that being present in the home and making strange statements afterward was not the same as proving every element beyond a reasonable doubt. But the state returned again and again to the same core facts. The children were alive when police first saw them. The former husband was gone. Inoue remained in the apartment. She later came to police with statements about voices and blood. Officers returned and found both children dead. The scene showed signs of concealment and cleanup. The physical evidence, in the prosecution's view, closed the space where doubt could survive. On the 24th of February, 2025, after about 2 hours of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. Yui Inoue was found guilty on all counts: 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of child abuse, and 1 count of disorderly conduct. She was not in the courtroom when the verdict was read because she had waived her right to be present. Even without her there, the verdict marked the legal answer to the central question of the case. The jury found that she was criminally responsible for what happened to Mia and Kai. The sentencing took place on the 2nd of May 2025. By then, Yui Inoue was 44 years old. The courtroom was no longer deciding guilt. That had already been settled by the jury. The only remaining question was punishment. Under Arizona law, the court had the power to impose natural life sentences, and the judge did exactly that. Inoue received 2 consecutive natural life sentences for the deaths of Mia and Kai. That meant she would not be eligible for release on those murder convictions. The court also imposed an additional 35 years for the child abuse and disorderly conduct counts to be served consecutively. The sentence made clear that she would spend the rest of her life in prison. At sentencing, the judge described the case as one of the hardest he had handled. Inoue also spoke through an interpreter and made statements suggesting that she still believed her children were not dead and were with her parents. That moment again raised the mental health issues that had hovered over the case from the beginning. But the court's sentence reflected the jury's verdict and the prosecution's evidence. The legal system treated the deaths of Mia and Kai as deliberate criminal acts, not an unexplained tragedy. The current status of the case is that Yui Inoue has been convicted and sentenced. She is serving 2 consecutive natural life sentences, plus 35 additional years. A criminal appeal file exists under State v. Inoue, but there is no public record showing that the conviction or sentence has been overturned. As of the latest public information, the judgment remains in place. The most haunting part of this case is the narrow timeline. Police were called before the children died. Officers went into the apartment. They saw Mia and Kai alive, asleep, and apparently unharmed. Then they left. Only hours later, the same police department was pulled back into the same apartment by Inoue's own statements at the station. This time, the children could not be saved. That timing is what gives the case its lasting force. It was not a mystery that began with 2 missing children or a long search. It began as a domestic dispute the kind police departments handle every day. It ended as a double murder case in which the mother was convicted of taking the lives of her own children after officers had already been inside the home. For investigators, the story came together through movement and sequence. A fight over money, a call from the former husband, officers seeing the children alive, the mother left alone with them, the later statements at the station, the return to the apartment, the hidden scene, the recovered evidence, and the actions that followed. Each step made the next one harder to dismiss. For the jury, the question was whether the evidence proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. After hearing the case, they decided it did. For the court, the question became how to sentence a mother convicted of ending the lives of two young children. The answer was 2 natural life sentences, one for Mia and one for Kai, followed by 35 more years for the remaining crimes. The case remains one of Tempe's most painful family crime cases because of how quickly the situation moved from a household argument to irreversible loss. Mia and Kai were not strangers caught in an unknown danger. They were children in their own home, seen alive by police only hours before they were found dead. And in the end, the court record showed that the person convicted of causing their deaths was the one person they should have been able to trust most. The strongest message from the Yui Inoue case is that a family crisis can turn deadly when conflict, isolation, and instability are left unchecked around vulnerable children. Mia and Kai were seen alive by police only hours before they were found dead. That narrow timeline is what makes the case so disturbing. The danger was not in a stranger's hands. It was inside their own home, after a domestic dispute that had already brought officers to the door. The lesson is that warning signs in family conflicts must be treated seriously, especially when children are present. Arguments about money, separation, relocation, or custody can create pressure, but pressure never removes a parent's duty to protect. When a situation involves threats, weapons, extreme behavior, or statements that suggest mental distress, the response must be immediate and protective, not temporary. This case also shows that accountability can come after trial, but prevention has to come earlier. A sentence can name the harm and punish the person responsible, but it cannot return Mia and Kai to life. Their story remains a warning that children must never be left unseen in the shadow of adult conflict when fear, anger begins to rise.